Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to ACTV today. I'm your host, Jenny Davidson. I am the CEO and Executive Director at Stand Up Placer here in Placer County. We have been around for about 40 years serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking in our community. If you are watching this show and something comes up and you feel like you really need to reach out and talk to somebody, we do have a crisis line that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can call that at 1-800-575-5352. And we offer services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. We have crisis counselors ready to talk to you anytime. We have in-person crisis management through our service offices, one in Roseville, one in Auburn. We offer legal support, therapy, group support. We have a safe house in an undisclosed location and housing located all over the community where survivors can go and live for 12 to 24 months while they're getting all the support needed to live a healthy, self-determined life. So if you need help while you're watching this today, something hits home, do feel free to call us on that 1-800-575-5352 phone number. Today, I have with me in the studio two amazing guests. They're both employees here at Stand Up Placer, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, my name is Isi, and I'm one of the sexual assault outreach and services specialists. So I work with sexual assault survivors.
Hi, I'm Adrienne. I'm the sexual assault outreach and services coordinator at Stand Up Placer.
Thank you so much for joining me here today. And today we have decided we're going to talk about sexual assault and also what is sexuality and what is consent. And it's such a huge topic that we will probably be having a follow-up because there are so many things to talk about. Mm-hmm. And but let's just start out. Let's talk a little bit about what is sexuality. That word is used for a lot of different things. And so just what is sort of a definition of sexuality and sex and just kind of the broad definition?
Well, usually when we talk about sexual assault, we definitely want to have a working definition of what sex is. Because if our definition of sex is very narrow, then we're only going to be looking at one form of sexual assault as sexual assault, when really there are a variety of forms. So different sexual contact can include touching, kissing.
It could also include like digital penetration with fingers or anal sex. Oral sex,
vaginal sex, flirting, sexting is a big one too that is more and more common these days. Mm-hmm. And just a variety of different acts can be sexual.
Mm-hmm. And I think like that when it crosses into maybe your more intimate space, anything that would not be appropriate for some people to do, and other people, you know, when it crosses into that, maybe that more intimate touch. And that's really for those two people to make a decision, right, about what they want to happen. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. And one thing that we talked about earlier as we were preparing for today is there are a lot of common misconceptions out in the community about how to prevent sexual assault and what is sexual assault and this whole stranger danger myth. And so can we talk just for a second about why are we talking about consent today, and is there, what the line between consent and like the stranger danger?
Well, sexual assault would be, you know, any of the aforementioned activities that is without explicit consent, right? And so consent is usually broken down into 4 areas. One is that it's clear, mutual, coherent, meaning that nobody is under the influence or asleep, and also ongoing. So when we are going to engage in a sexual act with our partner, whoever that is, whether it's a casual experience, maybe first, second, third date, or someone you've been married to for 25 years, there is still an aspect of consent that needs to be explicit and mutual on both parties.
And another thing I like to bring up when talking about consent is that it's good to look for positive body language and also an affirmative yes. So then having the verbal yes and also having that positive body language and making sure that they're matching is when you know that you have consent with the other party or other parties.
Definitely. And, you know, oftentimes there's kind of been this argument that a lack of a no what means consent, but that is not true. Just because somebody doesn't say no and punches you in the face does not mean that they're not consenting. So along with body language, which can be kind of hard to, you know, decipher, right? Definitely looking for that affirmative verbal confirmation. And, you know, it doesn't have to be awkward or feel out of place, you know. It can be like, do you like this? Does this feel good? You know, having that part of a healthy communication, you know, between all parties, everybody involved, to make sure like everyone's on the same page each step of the way, right? So as a sexual activity progresses, you know, keep checking in with your partner to make sure, yeah, is this okay? Are we both into this?
That's great. And you mentioned also they can't be incapacitated, and we all heard about the thing that happened at Stanford, right, with the student who was completely unconscious. And people think, well, you know, that happened one time at Stanford, and you know, luckily we caught the person, but it happens all the time. And I think making sure that our viewers know that too, and that especially if anybody is at home right now and they're thinking, I was at this gathering, this situation happened, and I felt really bad later because maybe I had been drinking, and then sex happened and I didn't really even know about it until the next day. And so that being coherent, being able to make that decision. And so are there other things that you look for in order to know for sure that this person is consenting? You know.
Well, first of all, Jenny, do you know what the #1 date rape drug is?
Tell me, Adrienne.
It's alcohol. So even though a lot of people think that it's like GHB or Rohypnol or whatever those drugs are, oftentimes what we see is alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. And that can be very tricky because I think that there is a point where people can drink and have consensual sex. But we see time and time again with the clients that we serve in the community, on the news, in the media, you know, it starts getting into this gray territory of, did you really consent? Were you really coherent enough to consent? What if both people were intoxicated?
Right. And so what we've seen really, though, is generally people might even say, oh, you can't drive. I'm taking your keys away because you're too intoxicated to drive. And yet they still initiate sex after that happens. So if they thought that this person was not able to drive right now, then they should know that they don't have the capacity to consent to sex. You know, and then there's also maybe couples who they've already consented, they've already talked about, they know what's going to happen later, and they choose to have a glass of wine or even get very intoxicated. But what I think that line is that consent happened while everybody was sober. Right?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then why is consent important? Why is this a topic that we're even having? It's 2018, you know, like what's going on that we're needing to have a conversation around consent?
Okay, well, I'll take this one. Well, consent is very important because, first off, before any sexual act happens, there needs to be a general consensus and a mutual agreement about what's happening, making sure that everyone's on the same page and is comfortable. And then, as we discussed before, without consent, if a sexual act does occur, then it is sexual assault. So that needs to be kept in mind with these kind of actions.
Exactly. And how come people, I talk to people, and if I ask people, how important do you think consent is? They'll say, oh, it's very important. You need to have consent. But then when I say, how do you get that? Like, what does that look like with your partner? How do you know that you have consent? Literally everybody says, I don't know. I've never had those conversations. So what has happened in our society just as boys grow up, as girls grow up, around conversations about sexuality, and how can we shift that?
Well, I think that there's been this kind of idea of men or boys, they're the ones that have to be persistent. They're the ones that want to have sex all the time, and that it's the girls or the women who are supposed to kind of like reserve their sex, and men are supposed to pursue or court and ask for consent, and the women are the bearers of the sexuality that like give consent, and so first, if we don't have these conversations about consent, we look at these like heterosexual relationships as just like this one-way street between like men wanting sex and needing the consent of women to give it. Whereas I feel like if you ask women, hey, when was the last time that you were the one that asked for consent when you were initiating a sexual act, or a sexual act was progressing and you checked in with your partner? It's not always that it falls on women to have to be asked. I feel like that's kind of a convoluted way to say what I'm talking about. But I think that there are these gender roles, gender expectations that play into consent, and that also kind of like makes the waters murky about like who asks for consent, who gives consent, how can we establish that consent was given and that it was mutual. So talking about consent is important. Because that having this discourse is what is going to enable us to have these clear definitions and be able to get that consent that we need.
Yeah, and kind of going to what you said, because I have the same experience when I do a lot of outreach events. I'm like, okay, well, how do you ask for consent? And people are like, I don't know. Or sometimes people tell me, I don't want to ask for consent because it's awkward or it'll ruin the mood. Or I know when someone's into me, so I don't have to ask. I just have to look at their body language. And to that I say, well, first, asking for consent can be like a really fun part of the experience. You're setting your boundaries. You can ask like in a cool, sexy way, just as long as you're getting your point across. And I also say, okay, asking for consent may be awkward, but is that such a bad thing?
Right.
Is it such a bad thing to have an awkward moment for like a minute or two, but then for sure that you have consent and you can like, get it on.
And it's enthusiastic, and everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, and it's fun. And the only reason, I feel like, personally for me, I feel like the reason why asking for consent is important is because we don't have many models that show us how to do it or what to do or how important it is. You look at TV and then people in a sex scene or a kissing scene, people will kind of just do it without asking first. And I'm like, well, as long as we normalize it and we keep doing it, then it's not going to be as awkward anymore. It's going to be a normal part of sex as it should be.
Right. Awesome. Fantastic. Yeah, and asking in a way, it doesn't have to be like, do you consent to act 1, 2, and 3? Right? It can be like, hey, do you like this? Does this feel good? Do you want me to do that? And then they're like, I want you to do that. So asking for consent and giving consent can be a very empowering thing. And something else we've talked about is empowering young people to have boundaries in other ways before it ever becomes like sexual interaction, right? So teaching our young children, if Uncle whoever comes over for dinner and says, hey, come give me a hug, can you talk a little bit about like body autonomy? How do we train our young people to start having conversations about who's allowed to touch them?
I definitely think it's important to talk about consent from a young age, and I think a lot of parents and caregivers get nervous because they're like, well, I don't want to talk about sex with my 5-year-old child, which, I completely understand. And you don't have to. Like, talking about consent with a toddler or a 5-year-old can look like, oh, you have the right to tell people who you want to hug and who you don't want to hug. So, like for your example, if like Auntie comes home and you don't want to hug her at the time, you have the right to say, no, actually, I don't want to give you a hug right now. Maybe like a high five. Or maybe I just don't want to be touched right now, and that's completely fine. And then the conversation will change like as they get older, like as they turn into teenagers, then talking more about sex and what that looks like and how to say yes, how to say no.
Fantastic. What are other, so we talked a little bit about ages, what are other stages, what are other things within a relationship that might change or evolve that affect how consent is given or implied or understood?
Well, I think that in different age groups and also different stages of a relationship, consent can start looking a little bit different. And it's still important and needs to be addressed. And one thing that I'm thinking is relationships. You know, possibly at the beginning of a relationship, especially when you're determining, is this more of a casual relationship? Is this a fling? Or is this more serious? There are those different parts of consent that you reach as you continue on. But I think sometimes in a long-term relationship, maybe there's kind of a sexual pattern that is there, you know, like maybe you have sex once or twice a week, and that's kind of the expectations. Mm-hmm. You know, it's still important to check in with your partner and have sex, even if for the last 10 years you have sex every Saturday night, you know. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, yes, I do actually. I think that when it comes to long-term relationships, there's this idea of, okay, we have our pattern. I know you, you know me, so I don't have to ask every single time. And you know that may be the case. You may have established that pattern, but it's still important to ask for consent, to talk about it, to talk about your boundaries first, just because, you know, that's healthy. And what if maybe, you know, you have this expectation, you've had sex once or twice a week, but then maybe the other person doesn't want to. It's still important to have that kind of conversation. Say, okay, do you really want to do this? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to do something else? And let's talk about that. Yeah, so it's still, consent is still very important in a long-term relationship.
And these can be parts of very loving, exciting conversations as well. Like we're coming across in a very clinical way, but it can be very exciting to have those conversations, especially after a 10-year marriage. You know, like, hey, we've always done A, B, and C, but do you think like Q and R might be on the table?
Yeah.
And being able to have those conversations as well, yeah. And just keeping those the topic open, and that's can be a really great part of the relationship, right?
Mm-hmm. I think another thing with sexual assault outside of a relationship that could potentially affect different ages is, you know, sexual assault is about power and control. It's not about sexual gratification. So when we have worked with, for example, seniors who have been sexually assaulted by caretakers or in a nursing home setting or by their doctor. And so establishing also consent and what is appropriate and inappropriate, because sometimes people in power are going to exploit that power. So I've worked with patients who were sexually assaulted in a medical setting, and you know, they let it go beyond their point of comfort because they felt like, well, this is a doctor or this is a medical technician, and I trust that this is part of the job that they need to do. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, maybe if your parents or your grandparents are starting to age, you know, having a conversation to be like, hey, when you see a doctor, you know, you have the right to ask for a chaperone, mm-hmm. you know, at all times. Or, you know, let's talk about what you feel is appropriate or inappropriate.
Over the last few years, we always track what percentage of our survivors are a certain victim type, right? And so in 2015 and 16, about 13% of our survivors over the age of 55 were sexual assault survivors, victims of sexual assault. But in 2017, that number shot up to 35%. That's a huge jump in what's happening right now with our over 55 population. And so really just making sure that people understand too that no matter what your age is, we are here to help you with whatever services you might need. You know, we often talk about this as if it only happens to, you know, 15 to 24-year-olds. And that is our primary person who's coming in for services, but it's absolutely happening younger and it's absolutely happening older, and we're seeing those survivors as well. And so just making sure that people, you're watching this from home and you think, hey, the situation happened a couple weeks ago and I was so uncomfortable, but I didn't know who to call or who to talk to. You know, if you're even just questioning, if you think something might have happened, you know, to go ahead and give us a call on that crisis line at 1-800-575-5352, and we'll be able to have that conversation with you and be able to talk to you about what happened to you and how was your situation maybe similar to something that one of us said, or how was it very different and you really want to talk about that. We talked a little bit about the stranger danger stuff, and that, yeah, we should all try and keep safe in all situations. You know, like probably don't go visit a very urban community and walk down the darkest alley in that city
with your Rolex on.
With your Rolex on, right? There's a few
Domineering.
things that might happen, right? But those aren't the sexual assaults that we mostly see. We mostly see situations, and one of the reasons we're talking about consent, we mostly see situations where the victim knows the perpetrator. And we see female victims, we see male victims, you know, it's happening across the board. We see heterosexual relationships, we see LGBTQ, you know, IA, all the way down there of all different kinds of people who are coming in for services. And we're absolutely there for you to help you no matter where on that spectrum you might be finding yourself, and whatever form of sexual assault may have happened, or somebody touched you in a way that made you feel uncomfortable and your walls went up, and maybe some situations the thing didn't happen, but that threat felt like it was there, and you just want somebody to talk to, then please do call us and we can have those conversations. Which sort of brings us around to me then asking you, so you both said that you work with services. So where does Stand Up Placer fit into all of this? When something happens out in our community or people want information, what is it that you are able to provide?
Well, we have our 24-hour crisis line, 1-800-575-5352, and 24/7, 365, so you're always able to get a hold of somebody, talk about any kind of situation. And then we have a service office in Auburn and a service office in Roseville. We have sexual assault advocates working out of both. And you can drop in or call to schedule an appointment. And we do one-on-ones where we may provide emotional support throughout whatever it is that you're going through, or what your family is going through, or what you and your friends are going through. So I would say emotional support is kind of one of the big services that we do. And we explain the different resources that are available. And if you're thinking, well, I think I want to make a police report, we can accompany you to make that report with law enforcement. We can talk about what the legal route usually looks like. We can also do
court accompaniments. We also do accompaniments to court. We also do accompaniments to medical forensic exams. So what that looks like is a nurse looking through your body as evidence and provide that kind of emotional support.
And just like follow-ups, and oftentimes, you know, if you are somebody that you know has been assaulted, it could be a very scary time with a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings that are going on as a result of the trauma. You know, maybe your memory isn't chronological. That is an effect of trauma. You know, maybe you're feeling ashamed, or you feel that it's so private you don't know who to talk to. Maybe you don't want to tell your mom or your sister. You know, we're here to talk to you and lay out those options. And I think one of the most important things is that we are a confidential resource. So if you are not ready to have other people involved, we're there to support you in a non-judgmental way, and with absolutely not violating that confidentiality.
So if a 17-year-old talks to you and says, I just had this situation happen last night. I'm terrified of my family finding out because I was drinking, but I really want help. Can they tell you, and is it still confidential?
Yes, they absolutely can. So for minors, we are still a confidential resource. So the only way we could give out any information is if you explicitly ask us to.
Fantastic. And how can the community support Stand Up Placer or survivors? What's the first thing you would say? Somebody comes to someone and says, this thing happened last week. What is the most important one thing you can leave our listeners, viewers with?
Believe them.
Yes.
That is number one. Number one. You know, we are entrenched in a society that consistently questions the validity of believers, the validity of what they're saying, and it's wrong, it's inappropriate. We really need to move past this. If somebody discloses sexual assault, believe them. 80% of people who disclose to someone and are believed by that first person go on to seek other therapeutic resources on their path to healing. And the most important thing that you can do is believe them. Don't play Mr. or Miss Fix-It and say, this is what you need to do, because you're looking at a person that just had power taken away from them. And even though you may feel like you want to be supportive, what you're doing is continuing to exert your power over them by making decisions for them. Yes. So believe them and say, how do you want me to support you? And listen.
That's awesome. How can they, a lot of people right now, they may feel like this has never happened in their lives, but they want to be a support to Stand Up Placer. What are some things that they can do to be supportive of the agency?
You can like us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can follow us on Twitter.
You can also volunteer at the service offices or at the thrift store.
And we have a big event coming up. You'll be hearing more about that very soon. You can come to our Stand Up and Dance with the Placer County Stars.
Yeah.
It's going to be, it's very, very fancy.
I believe that is in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It's a nationally recognized month of awareness. And we host a array of different activities, events, workshops. So we will have that calendar on our Facebook. So if you're interested in supporting us and meeting us in person and listening to us talk, you know, come out.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, and I just want to thank both of you. It takes a lot of bravery to come out and courage, have a camera pointed at you for half an hour and be able to talk about something that you're so passionate about, a cause that you both care deeply for. Not only that, you show up 40 hours a week and you hear some of the most tragic, impactful, traumatic events that people have to share, and you show up with so much compassion and concern for those survivors. So thank you so much for being here and for doing what you do and caring about the cause that you care about. And thank all of you who've tuned in today and or watched us on YouTube or on ACTV and just really want to care and be a part of a change in our community. And so let's just get together and make this happen. let's make consent something that people, it just happens and people understand, and sexual assault goes away. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Thank you.